That's not necessarily where you want to start a relationship, but we don't know what, happens after that.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never fear change. Life is too short for fear. Chase what is desired.
I can do this all day.
Would you mind identifying what you are?
We're the best friends squad.
That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team.
Welcome to the rodeo. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
This is the way.
I have spoken.
Welcome to Skiffing Fanties Into the Wardrobe, our show exploring classic children's films. I'm Shaun.
I'm Jen.
And on today's show, we'll be discussing Willow, the 1988 fantasy film directed by Ron Howard, written by Ron Howard and someone named Bob Dolman. But it's mostly just Ron Howard because it's Ron Howard. Also one of the greatest films of the 80s ever to be made.
It is one of the greatest films of the 80s, and I'm a little bit angry at all the people that disagree with that statement.
There are quite a lot. This is also, as I recall, story by George Lucas, obviously through Lucasfilm and ILM, which is how Ron Howard got attached to the project in the first place.
Yeah, after doing Cocoon.
Yep, and most of you, if you are listening with children, or children-ish aged people, they may know Ron Howard as the director of Solo, because that's probably the most recent work that they probably have seen, because he took over directing duties for Solo.
No comment.
I love Solo,
I know
and I don't
you
really
do.
care if you don't like Solo, because your opinion almost is as much, it's like worth like 3 cents.
To you, as worthless as the critics' opinions of Willow.
Even more worthless.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Regardless, this film stars the amazing Warwick Davis as the titular character, Willow. Of good. Then it also stars Val Kilmer as Mad Mardigan, Joanne Wiley as Sorsha, Jean Marsh as the evil queen Babmorda, Patricia Hayes as Finn Rizal, Pat Roach as General Kale, and so on and so forth, with a notable role by Kevin Pollak. And Billy Barty as High Aldwin, who is the sorcerer of the Nelwynds.
Yeah, probably should mention that this is likely the only film in history that features a very, very enormous cast of people with dwarfism.
Yes.
Little people, as some people refer to them. We will not be using the other word.
No, we will not.
At all. But it is probably, and I say there have obviously been films that have had many of them in it, but I would say this is probably one of the few that gives a positive, what I would say like a quote unquote normal portrayal of them, because a lot of time they're just there to be, comedic effect, etc., which are some of the roles that characters in this do get to play, but they also get to play warriors and wizards and farmers and all kinds of other just everyday fantasy character types. I mean, there's Wizard of Oz, but I would not argue that Wizard of Oz is necessarily a very positive portrayal, because they're not meant to be presented as everyday people who happen to fill different roles. They're meant to sort of be like the thing that gets Dorothy on her journey, and then they're forgotten.
I mean, that's true, but it is a massive cast of little people, and that was that was definitely the earliest, I think, in Hollywood, and especially as positive as it was. It's probably not the most positive representation that one could ask for, but at the same time, within the context of the film, for sure, it is a totally positive representation. And they are heroes of the story, so to speak. Yeah. And they're singing, they're dancing, just like everybody else in the cast is. And it's a wide variety of characters, and it is, I would say, for early Hollywood, pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's a very large number of people, and some of the people who are in this may have been their first acting role ever.
Yeah, for sure. And that was both true of Wizard of Oz and probably this one as well.
Yeah.
This was Warwick Davis's first film as the lead.
He got his break through Return of the Jedi playing an Ewok.
Yes, and obviously we love the Ewoks and we love the Star Wars films, but Warwick Davis really, this is an incredible role for him. And I wish there had been a lot more after this. I wish this movie had done well. It makes me literally angry now that this movie didn't do better. and was not turned into a whole franchise of films because it's just so wonderful on so many levels. But why don't we get to what the movie is about?
Which is going to be your cue to continue talking, Jen, because I voluntold you to be the summarizer for Willow from 1988. So please, Jen, what is the story of Willow?
How dare you do this to me? I mean, I literally just watched it. I'm just really bad at summaries, as you all well know. So this is a cruel and unusual punishment. However, Willow is the story of a young farmer who is caught up in a prophecy about a baby that will be the end of an evil sorceress, Bavmorda. So the movie actually starts with the baby getting born and identified as the baby that will end Bavmorda. She has a sign on her arm. But then she is saved by our first hero of the story, who is not a warrior, but is actually a midwife. So props to this movie. After the midwife is killed, unfortunately, the baby is found by Willow and his 2 children. At first, they hide the baby, but then they are forced to reveal that the baby has been found when their village is attacked by Bavmorda's dogs. So the town decides that Willow, well, really, the High Aldwin, who is the sort of magical leader of the Nelwyn, which is what Willow is a member of these people, the Nelwyn. And they live off in the woods, separate from humans who are in this called Daikini. There's also other types of magical figures, fairies and brownies, and trolls, and all sorts of things. It is definitely like a high fantasy world. Bavmorda is like going through this reign of terror across the land. So that's like looming in the background, but it hasn't really touched the Nelwyn at this point. But Willow has instantly fallen for this adorable child who we later find out is named Elora Danon. And he agrees to take her from his village with the help of a few others to the crossroads where they hope they can find someone to save the child, where they hope they can find a Daikini specifically to save the child or take the child. At this point, they don't necessarily know that she needs to be saved, just that they want her out of their village. At the crossroads, they meet Madmartigan, who is in a cage. And through a series of events, Madmartigan is freed and given the child to take away. But enter the fairy queen, Charalandra, who tells Willow that he is going to be a great sorcerer and he's also Elora Danon's protector, and that he must find the great sorceress Finrazel, give her Charalandra's wand, and save Elora Danon. And they have to go to the castle at Tiraslene, where a great king and queen will take care of her. So that's essentially the impetus for the rest of the action in this film. And I'm not going to tell you everything except to say there is a love interest, Sorsha. There is dashing knights. There is evil and good and magic and everything else that one could want in a high fantasy film. But the core, the heart of this movie is 100% Warwick Davis as Willow of Good. So I think I'm going to stop there with the description, because if you haven't seen the movie, go watch it immediately. What is wrong with you? If you have seen the movie, you essentially know what the rest of the movie is, and we're going to be spoiling it over the course of this conversation anyway. So, is that an acceptable summary?
I mean, look, it's going to have to do... We're in a crunch because we're in a pandemic, and so I just have to accept what we can get, Jen.
Oh, gee, thanks.
It was suitable.
It was suitable. Perfect. I'll take suitable over terrible any day of the week.
Good, because that's the best I can give, Jen. Because if I do it too much, you'll get way too in your head, and you'll become a dictator at that point.
I probably will. That's true.
Yeah.
So... why don't we get to our general impressions, and I will let you go first, since I just spent a lot of time talking already.
Well, so Willow, I think it should be fairly clear that I love this film, And I think we both love this film, probably for some similar reasons and probably for some others. I originally saw this film, not in theaters because I was 5 when this movie came out, a little bit young. But I did see this film as a result of being a Star Wars guy and realizing this was a Lucasfilm production. And being the super dork that I was like, oh, well, I should see what this thing is about. Also learning that Warwick Davis was in both Return of the Jedi, my favorite Star Wars movie, and also this. So I kind of followed along. And I will admit, as a kid, this movie freaked me out. And
it has some pretty scary spots. I'm not gonna lie.
Not for the reasons that you think.
Interesting. Okay.
It freaked me out because as a kid, I had never really seen a person with dwarfism before, of any variety of which there are many different types. And so as a kid, I was a little bit freaked out by the cast because there were so many people here who were people who from my child's perspective, they didn't look quote unquote right. As a kid, right? And kids were like ignorant and dumb. But this film was probably the reason why I don't think that way anymore. Because I liked the film and I kept watching it and going, well, these people they're just people. They're just like, they just look different and but they do the same stuff and like all of these things. And also like they keep calling him Peck all the time. Like, what is this about? Well, stop it. It's not very nice.
Right.
So I think as a kid, it freaked me out and then it helped me become less freaked out. I love this film for a lot of very good reasons, which are the reasons I'm sure we both agree, which is it is a lot of fun. It's got a lot of lovely fantasy elements. It's a rip-roaring adventure. There's magic and there's fun little creatures and all kinds of like Kevin Pollak playing a little brownie. Like all of these things are really cool. You know, I love Mad Mardigan and all of these fun adventure things. And there is like a little bit of a romance here and all of these. Like, it has all the pieces of a lovely fantasy adventure. But I also really, really appreciate that this film continues to make me a better person, which I know sounds like maybe for some people it seems like a strange reason, but I think is really, really important and why this film, in my opinion, should be a national treasure.
I fundamentally agree, maybe for different reasons, but I don't necessarily recall what my reaction was about the fact that the cast was all little people. I knew who Warwick Davis was, and I can't remember why. I think probably through marketing of the films, of the Star Wars films, or something else. However, in terms of making you a better person, there is no better character than Willow to introduce just what it means fundamentally to be a good person. Willow is like just so good. He still gets angry. You know, like he has moments of outburst. He messes up. He's so very human in terms of like just going through life and trying to do his best. And this is a character that like at the start, he very much wants to be a sorcerer, like the High Aldwin. And at the very beginning, we find out that the High Aldwin is going to choose an apprentice. And unfortunately, Willow doesn't have much confidence. I think one of the really interesting things that happens in terms of the Nelwyns is they just consider the Daikini giants, right? So they're the Nelwyn. They happen to be in our world, in the human Earth world, they are people with dwarfism. In the Willow fantasy world, they are Nelwyn. They all are short, right? But even within that society, there's still height discrimination, which I think is a really fascinating thing to have put into that, right? Like there is still discrimination within that world, and he's consistently called out for that by the taller members of the Nelwyn village. Most notably, what's his butt? Buttlecrook? Burglecut.
The super hyper capitalist of this universe.
Yeah, exactly. I quipped that he's basically the Monsanto of the Nelwyn village because he
Correct.
Literally has a monopoly on seed selling.
Yeah, played by the wonderful Mark Northover, who I think honestly as a sub villain, I would say, absolutely kills it.
Oh yeah.
There's that brilliant moment when he laughs in Willow's face And, like, you hate him in that moment a lot, but you're also like, man, like, he really sells this.
Yeah.
You can totally believe he is the cutthroat jerk businessman of that town. That's totally him.
It's actually really interesting because the cast of Nelwyn is truly a brilliant cast. Billy Bart as the High Aldwyn is just utterly fantastic. Like, his wife, Kaya, is played by Julie Peters, who has not been in many other films.
This was her first role.
She is brilliant, and I honestly challenge you to find a better actress who goes into a first role and kills it like Kaya does. I have never... It's very rare that you see so much genuine emotion from an actress, and she's just, I cry just every time she talks because she's so good. But unfortunately, she's not in the entire movie, and it makes me a little bit mad. I'll be honest.
There aren't a whole lot of women in this, although let's give this film some credit.
Yeah.
That there are more than what you would expect.
Way, way more. We're going to talk about that in a minute, because I think it's one of the very notable things about Willow. Needless to say, Willow himself is just a genuinely kind person, which is why he agrees to, like, he ignores his better instincts in the very beginning. He's like, no, let's just push it away and forget the baby was ever here. And of course his children are like, but Dada! And he's like, ugh, I'm a sucker for my children, who he calls Bobbins. And by the way, I think we should bring Bobbins back as a way to reference children. I'm just saying, because that's the cutest thing ever. But his children and his wife are part of whom make him the good person that he is. It's through them that he decides that he's going to help Elora Danan, and through building confidence in himself. So he's really a fantastic, I mean, like, we talk about farm boys, but so many farm boys are, like, legitimately just, like, kind of bratty brats. And a little bit selfish, and they just want to get out into the big world. That's not what Willow wants. Willow genuinely wants to be with his family, to take care of his farm, just to live, hopefully he wants to be a sorcerer, but he just wants, like, my husband joked that he's like, so Willow started out as basically an NPC and then ended the movie as a level 1 wizard.
Yep.
I was like, yeah, basically. And that's an amazing character arc. Like, honestly.
I mean, it should be noted that there's some very overt references with the Nelwyn to hobbits.
Oh, yeah.
This is fairly obvious that there's a lot of that borrowing, because it's the same thing with Bilbo from The Hobbit, right? That he doesn't want to leave his hole. Granted, he's not a farmer, so he's... Right. I don't exactly know what hobbits do to make a living. They just, like, stay in their holes.
Most of them are farmers, but his family specifically, if we're talking about the Baggins, they're just wealthy.
Oh, okay. Well, they're far less interesting now.
Yeah,
so.
No, the Baggins are, like, just, like, I don't even know why they're wealthy, but they're basically just wealthy landowners.
They're probably just like the Burgle Cuts. They're just slightly nicer.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but there's sort of like this trope of, like, the person who gets, they get sucked into an adventure they didn't want. They just wanted to stay where it was safe and everything, but then they have to, like, rise to the challenge.
Yes, that's true. I mean, that is a trope too. It's just not.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen anywhere near as often in fantasy, especially in the 80s, as one might think it does. That's kind of my point.
I don't know. I think it happens a lot more than you think.
Does it though?
Never-ending story. Sebastian gets sucked into a thing he doesn't want to be in.
No. You can't even... It's not Sebastian, it's Bastian. And you cannot argue with Bastian. If you argue it with anybody, it's Atreyu, but only within the book and not within the movie. Because Atreyu
Bastian gets sucked into something he doesn't want either.
Yeah, but he doesn't want to be where
That's the whole story.
Either. No, he really just doesn't want to be where he is more importantly. In the book of The Neverending Story, though, you are correct in terms of Atreyu specifically is like, why go find somebody else? I am a hunter. My job is to hunt the purple buffalo. Just leave me alone. And the guy's like, nope, can't do that.
It's a common trope, but that's not why I was saying that it was a common trope. I was trying to point out that part of what I think is important about this film is that, unlike a lot of other stories where characters have to get sucked into adventures they don't want, those characters in a lot of cases are either privileged or are human children of quote unquote normal size.
Average size,
excuse me. This is a story that's about people who are very much outside of the wheelhouse of the sort of the Kini world, the giants of this world, who just really kind of want to like live over there and be left alone, but get constantly sucked into these people's nonsense. And it's about this guy who really is a very humble, everyday, average guy who really gets sucked into this. He doesn't come from a position of privilege. He's like about to lose his farm.
Yeah.
You know, he's about to lose everything. He's got this family and these 2 kids he's got to care. He's a dad, right? He's not meant to be like a kid. A lot of the time it's kids that are these reluctant heroes. He's not a kid.
Yeah. How often do we see parents as heroes? Period.
Yeah. And in an interesting way, this film is I wouldn't say the themes like explored all that much, but it is a very, very much a movie that's about parenthood and taking care of children and all that. Because, Willow takes this very clear role, right? When he falls for the little kid, like when the kid giggles at him, and that's basically what does him in.
I mean, she is adorable.
She is adorable. And they get that kid. I don't know how they got that baby to give some of those faces.
I imagine filming that, because I wondered that too. It's actually a set of twins that played the baby Elora Danan. Ruth and Kate Greenfield. And I think there was actually one other child that was a stand-in at one point, but they are seriously expressive children. I don't know how old they were when they did this.
Well, they obviously weren't infants proper. They were very young.
They were born April 16th, 1987, and the movie came out in 1988. I don't know when filming was, but they were definitely under a year. They're probably under 9 months.
Then they were proper infants.
Yeah, no, they were proper infants.
That's interesting, because they filmed from April to October. And obviously we don't know when exactly in that period they used the children. But
yeah, most of the time I'm sure they didn't, because what you notice very quickly is that the baby isn't actually in the same shot as everybody most of the time. There are definitely some notable exceptions to that, but most of the time they're just focusing on her face, because that means that they could have filmed it at any point in time, essentially, right?
Well, and there's also probably safety reasons for why you do that, because...
Well, obviously.
You've got people running around with her strapped on someone's back, and yeah.
There's quite a bit of action in this movie, but we have gone here and there and everywhere, and I'm just going to go back to the fact that my overall impression is that this is a wonderful movie. It is a wonderful adventure. It has a wonderful hero and has some great, like, character development in other characters. It's not just, like, Willow doesn't actually change over much except become more confident in who he is and his abilities, which is very important. But Mad Mardigan develops, Sorsha changes, and I have some issues with Sorsha's change, but that's neither here nor there. I still love her so much. She was like my hero when I was a kid, so just say.
Okay. Well, anyway, so maybe we should talk about some of the interesting production qualities about this film, because this is a special effects film.
It is a special effects film, and it was inevitably... Did you check to see what Oscar awards that it was nominated for?
Sound effects, editing, and visual effects.
Yes.
They lost to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, by the way, which I kind of agree with.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think the special effects in this have not quite aged very well in some spots. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I think, has aged a bit better, but I think that's largely because they used cartoon characters.
Yeah.
And so there's a we don't have to believe that Roger Rabbit is like a real physical entity in the same way.
Right. Whereas we have to believe that the brownies are really only like 3 inches tall.
Right, and they're really inside Willow's pocket.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Like, it's a little bit different because there's just a little bit more of the playfulness, I think, in Who Framed Roger Rabbit than this film can't quite get there, because the actors are not cartoon characters, and so they have a limit to what physically their bodies can do.
That said,
the visual effects are still pretty impressive. They're still really cool.
They are pretty impressive, and they're light on special effects. It's like, there are special effects, don't get me wrong. However, the majority of the special effects are actually just the brownies. Like, through most of the film, that's all you're dealing with is the brownies. Which, granted, must have been tricky, and they do a very, very good job of it. The only notable exceptions to that in terms of special effects are the Hydra dragon in a hilarious turn of bad wizardry.
Yep.
And then the shape-shifting for Fin Raziel.
Which is important because that was the technology that had been invented that made this film possible.
Exactly. And then
the morphing technology.
The morphing technology. And then it went on to be in other films.
It's important to note that I know that a lot of people like to be mad at George Lucas and talk about how much they don't like George Lucas and they hate him and all of these things. But almost all of George Lucas's career has been using film to push and advance the technology of filmmaking. This is another example. He started coming up with the idea for this film in 1972, before Star Wars. Well, presumably he had the idea for Star Wars before that, but I don't exactly know the timeline there. But he knew that he couldn't do the things he wanted to do because the technology wasn't there. So he did Star Wars, which also the technology wasn't there, and so he invented a lot of technology in order to do Star Wars. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, ILM, the company he essentially created, eventually came up with the technology to make this possible. So in the 80s, that's when he started going, oh, I can make this fantasy film. And then he ran into the same problems he runs into every time, at least until he started making so much money that they had to shut up and just throw things at him, which is that he would take it to a studio and the studio would go, well, that's not going to make any money. And then he would go, well, fine, I'll take it to somebody else and finally convince somebody to give me money to make this movie. And then he made this movie. This was with the late MGM, because I think MGM is now gone, if I recall correctly. Who knows? Whatever, doesn't matter. But he brought it to MGM, and they eventually got this off the ground. It did make money. It did make a lot of money. It made $100 million was the gross from it, roughly the gross of its box office on a $35 million budget. Pretty expensive film for the 80s. Okay, they made a profit. Wasn't that great. They made a lot of money off of home video, by the way. $15 million. Woo.
Well, because kids loved it.
He sold the rights to it. But anyway, the point is, like, there's all this technology being made for this, and this is, like, Lucas's entire career is being, like, in what way, like, what's the technology at? What do I need it at? Do I need to wait, or do I just need to invent it?
Yeah.
And a lot of times he just invents it. In this case, waiting, but...
Really, what everybody should remember is that George Lucas's baby, Lucasfilm / ILM, is what basically created our childhood if you're talking outside of Disney.
Pretty much.
Because they did everything. Literally everything that you loved from your childhood was probably an ILM production in some way, shape, or form. They probably had their hand on it. If you're talking fantasy and science fiction, if you were talking things that had special effects, it was ILM. And so, I mean, it's granted, this is just one piece of that, but this one piece was that morphing technology. And basically what happens, if you haven't seen the movie, why haven't you seen the movie, is that Fin Raziel is, when they first find Fin Raziel, she starts out as a possum, and then he has to shift her back into her form. And I think it's one of the loveliest things is that she thinks she's like a young woman, and she ends up not being a young woman.
You know who plays her, right? Patricia Hayes.
She is so good in The Neverending Story. And I'm so jealous of her hair in this movie.
She does have really lovely flowy hair.
It's beautiful, beautiful, white, gorgeous, flowing locks. And I'm just...
But anyway, so she thinks she's a young woman, so when she's finally transformed,
yes,
she finds out she's not, that she's actually been that, and she's been that way for a lot longer than she thought.
Originally, though, the thought was that they would just turn her from a goat directly into the woman, into her daikini body, presumably. But they didn't, the director or the visual effects supervisors didn't like he actually found it too complicated. The quip that I saw, that he essentially was like, this is ridiculous and it's not working. And so that's why they invented the morphing technology that then went on to be used elsewhere. And I'm always like, wait, so he basically just thought it was a little bit too complicated, so he decided to make something easier? That's just brilliant. I love it. Because it looks really cool.
The morphing scene, right, because she gets morphed a number of times. She starts as a possum, she gets made into a crow, then she's made into a goat, and then finally, Willow's powers, he finally gets the confidence, and he morphs into a number of other animals before she finally morphs into her daikini form. And so, if I recall, ostrich, tortoise, she goes sort of ostrich, peacock, tortoise, tiger, and then Finn Rizal. Now, I gotta be honest. If he stopped at the tiger, that would have been a pretty like
that would have been pretty baller.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. But she couldn't use her wands.
Well, she could hold it in her little tiger mouth. And just be like,
yeah, she needs to be able to talk and wave. So
that's fair. But anyway, so the point is, like, they got this great morphing technology, which is pretty good and still holds up reasonably well. And overall, the film has a number of wonderful special effects shots, some of which age a bit. We talked about the brownies, right? They're meant to be about 3 inches tall, and so sometimes they're on sets with extra large items, and sometimes they're superimposed over the sets that the other actors are in, the actors who are meant to be at their regular size. But you also got some really wonderful cinematography shots. So if Paul was here, I think he would have been really pleased with some of those beautiful shots from like the side of the mountain looking down.
This movie is legitimately gorgeous if you're just talking scenery, because it was filmed in a number of places, including Wales, but most notably New Zealand. And like thinking about it, it's probably, I would love to know the sort of the history of filming fantasy films in New Zealand, because this has got to be one of the earlier ones. And it's to great effect in this film.
So I've got the list for you of some of the locations that are specifically marked to help you with this. You ready?
I know one of them is in California. It's the falls, and they're very pretty in the very beginning.
Yep, Burney Falls in California, one of the falls that we see. The mountain and lake scenes are all done in Queenstown, Otago, New Zealand. Hopefully I've said that correctly. There's also a lake kayaking scene, which is in New Zealand, but is done at Milford Sound. There are a number of other locations. They're not specified what specifically was filmed there, but other parts. So Cardrona Ski Field presumably is one of the snow locations. That's in Wanaka, New Zealand. But there are also a number of UK places like Wales. So the Knockmar Castle exterior is Snowdonia in Gwynedd, Wales. Then there's the Knockmar Castle exterior set, which was in Dinorwig Quarry, which makes sense because that they just need to be in some dirt.
There's a lot of rocks. Bavmorda definitely has a very, very, very specific sense of style that any goth would be truly jealous of, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. So you've got the cart chase sequence, which is a classic of fantasy when people are being chased on horseback. That's at Black Park.
And this one is a really good one.
Yeah, it's a pretty solid one. It's really fun. And they have to do a lot in this sequence because, again, they have the brownies.
Yeah.
And we have to see them. So they have the regular cart, right, with all of the normal-sized people, right, the people that are not being superimposed, fighting and rolling around and I imagine quite dangerously because, you know, they're moving at like 35 miles an hour. But then you have to like do these giant versions of the sets for these 3-inch tall brownies. So they have to have made these giant barrels that were like, had to have been like 30 feet tall just so that it would look the right size.
Yeah, who knows what they did. But it's done to very good effect in this scene for sure.
If you want to know some of the other beautiful sequence, I just want to go through these because the people should go see them. Most of the Nelwyn Valley scenes are done at Brocket Hall, Lemsford, Welwyn Garden City, and Hertfordshire, England, by the way. And there are some others. So there's another waterfall scene that's at Powerscourt Estate, which is in Wicklow, Ireland. And there are other locations where various things were done, including a forest. When Willow prepares to leave the village, that's in a place called Epping Forest in Essex. So there's just a lot of wonderful, gorgeous locations that are filmed for this, primarily outside the United States. And by primarily, I mean almost entirely, some of which is in New Zealand. Now, I'm curious if the ski field that they filmed at is the same ski field where they have the mountain parrots that live up there who are like giant jerks who run around and destroy everything.
I have no idea. That's not a thing I'd ever heard of before, but I have to say that scene remains one of my favorite chase scenes in the history of film.
Really?
Yes. I mean, come on. Okay, the sequence is hilarious, but it's very exciting to watch people sledding down a very, 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 very steep mountain. Scared the crap out of me when I was a kid, on one hand. On the other hand, was also super exciting. Like, total adrenaline rush. Because it is an incredibly steep mountain, but it has such a fun ending. And I think that's sort of the important part, is that not only is the beginning fun, like the beginning is them trying to escape with the baby after Mad Mardigan has messed everything up by falling in love with Sorsha because of fairy dust, the dust of broken hearts. And then, so they're forced to escape after General Kale, who's terrifying and has the coolest skull helmet in the history of skull helmets.
Yeah, he is pretty cool.
Catches Willow with the baby while Mad Mardigan is wooing Sorsha in an amazing sequence of poetry. And
you were wooed, admit it.
Yeah, and like there's some issues with Sorsha being like, wait a minute, like, why am I not killing this man? But there's probably like a feminist takedown of why it's crap somewhere. I'm going to tell you why it's not, though, really quickly.
Sure, yeah. Give me your perspective, and then if it's not different from mine, I'll give you mine.
Well, if you think about the atmosphere that Sorsha was raised in, where, you know, her mother is literally an evil sorceress empress who is killing everyone. This is a woman who has been, I mean, like, y'all have to see Bavmorda's castle. That could not have been a fun place to grow up. I don't know if it's like her original home.
It's dark and dank. It probably has mildew problems.
Dark and dank and literally has like dead bodies hanging everywhere.
Yeah, like her mom is dark. Like her mom like takes like emo a little bit far.
I mean, her final outfit, her final form, she's wearing like basically mummy wraps, and
right?
She's twisted and terrifying. And Jean Marsh, I'm sorry, if y'all have seen Return to Oz, Jean Marsh is one of the scariest women that has ever lived. Ever.
She has a way of making her face more terrifying, even without extra makeup, right? Because she does have a transformation of sorts in the film.
She has very, very sharp features. And when she's the head, the evil head in the Return to Oz, it's just, I was terrified of her. But this is not a friendly environment that Sorsha has grown up in, okay? Bavmorda does not, like, she trusts her daughter completely, but probably because her daughter has been raised to utterly fear her mother. And she's been surrounded by soldiers her entire life, soldiers who are terrified of her mother. I guarantee that nobody has ever looked upon her kindly in her life.
Yep, your reasoning is the same as mine, that's probably what the film is going for.
I don't think it's as developed as it could have been, obviously, because it's not necessarily the point of this movie. But her sort of shift from, I'm going to kill you, to suddenly becoming the center of someone's universe who isn't afraid of her mother and is specifically defying everything that she's known. I totally get it. I 100% get that. And, you know, that's not necessarily where you want to start a relationship, but we don't know what, happens after that. They agree to, at the end, help raise Elora Danan in some way, shape, or form, possibly, but we don't get to see what happens after that final scene. One of the things that is not really spoken about and probably is developed more in the books, I would hope, maybe will be developed more in the series that we are going to get, fingers crossed, is the fact that Tir Asleen was a castle of a kingdom that had an army and had a king and a queen. And that's where Willow is supposed to be taking Elora Danan. When they get there, it's been cursed, and we learn from Fin Raziel that Bavmorda cursed it. Everybody is trapped in like essentially amber, some sort of crystalline substrate, and frozen in time as the castle has rotted around them and been taken over by trolls. Oh my god, those trolls, by the way, terrified me. Just utterly terrified me. They seem to suck all light from around them. And so when I watched Attack the Block, I was like, oh, the trolls are basically the Attack the Block alien. But that was just me. Probably. Anyway, that king and queen are awakened. We don't know what happens to Saoirse and Madmartigan in their relationship. We don't. We do know that in real life, they got married. Val Kilmer and Joanna Whaley did get married for about 8 years, and they had 2 children, so that's cool. But that doesn't necessarily happen in the movie, or in the storyline of Willow. And I'd love to see what happens after that. It would be cool, but my point is, all of it made sense to me then. I mean, he was a dashing hero. Of course you're going to fall in love with him. Now I'm like, actually, no, that totally tracks, that she'd at least be, not necessarily have fallen madly back in love with him, but be swayed by the gentleness and the love and the respect and the skill and everything else that she sees between Madmartigan and then obviously Willow and the baby. Things that she has never been able to see before in her life. And I loved that aspect of it. I loved it when I was a kid. I love it now. And maybe this is just me trying to find reasons that Saoirse is one of the coolest freaking fighter ladies in the history of fantasy films. She still is, like, frankly. She has, like, the coolest costumes and the coolest sword.
Sure, Jen, yeah. Can I butt in now?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So your reasoning is probably similar to mine. I came to that conclusion too, that she's probably never had somebody say things that... Right, because he's under a spell. He gets this magic fairy dust thrown in his face, and so he's not really in full control of himself. But at the same time, the fairy dust doesn't make you... It makes you say things you wouldn't say to that person, but he's still feeling these things, and he's expressing these things, and he's expressing these poetic, loving sentiments, which she's never experienced. Her mother, there's nothing in the story to suggest at any point that her mother has ever been loving, kind, has probably ever said a kind word to her, has ever said anything supportive. And here's this guy saying, like, if you kill me, like, death would be nothing compared to love, right? Like, he's just so...
10,000 cuts. I can't remember the lines. It is fantastic poetry. And frankly, if anybody ever said any of that stuff to me, I mean, I'd be swayed.
Well, perhaps. But the one thing I will say that is, like, we can kind of recognize that this, because it's not developed, this is probably both where the film is really successful and both where it is unfortunately very flawed, which is that this film has some pretty great character plot lines and stories that do get some resolution and change, right? There is character development here for a number of characters, right? Willow, for example, begins as a quote-unquote lowly farm boy, right? With his family, he's just a sort of everyday kind of guy who, like, doesn't have any special ability, but he wants to be special, but he doesn't have confidence in himself. By the end, he has confidence in himself. He has found that he has some gift, some ability, right, that makes him special.
He is at least a first-level wizard.
Right, he becomes a first-level wizard, right? Really important that that's development. To be fair, this is Willow's story. After all, it's called Willow. So that's the story we get. But Madmartigan's the same way, because when we see him, he begins as a really sort of like dishonored swordsman who may or may not be a thief and has certainly committed a number of crimes of varying degrees. He sleeps around, he messes with other people's wives, right? To be fair, the one guy's wife that he messes around with, that guy has issues of all kinds of, right? But he starts out as just not a good man.
He's a scoundrel, and he's a scoundrel with no loyalty. And that's right. The important aspect of who Madmartigan is when we meet him. And what's fascinating is we actually get to see that change not just on the screen as we're watching him change. We get to see that other people recognize that.
Specifically, that would be Eric Thalgbear. Who is played by Gavin O'Herlihy, who's an Irish actor who plays this general, because he's our connecting point, because our focus is Willow, right? And so our connecting point into the world is through the Nelwyn. But we get this moment where it's like, oh, we learn who Madmartigan is, and like the people who probably once respected him have lost that, right? Madmartigan doesn't serve anybody but himself, is what we're basically told. And then there's the moment when he says, I serve the Nelwyn, right? And that's about almost 2/3 into the film when we see that huge shift. Yeah. And then by the end, right, we see that Madmartigan is not the scruffy scoundrel. He is kind of Han Solo in this, right? He finds this lovely suit of armor, and he's really going all out to try to help and save this girl, this child, and all of these things. So we see his development. It's pretty remarkable change from scoundrel to, hero to heroic figure. We do get that with Saoirse, but it's just not as developed, and that's perhaps its greatest flaw, which is the story is there, it just doesn't have enough pieces the way that we get with Madmartigan. I think if we'd had as the same amount of material for Madmartigan and Saoirse, you would see a bit more of that. It would also give us more time for them to develop a relationship that, like, maybe dealing with the fact that he was on fairy shrooms the first time.
But I mean, I think that's one of the greatest flaws of epic fantasy translating onto film.
Yeah.
This was a 2 hour and 7 minute film.
6 hours, Jen. It should have been 6 hours.
I completely agree, personally. Like, this is like one of those films that I'm like, ooh, give me so much more. I want all their adventures.
But you're right, it's 2 hours and 6 minutes, but this is also a film that it's pretty clearly meant for, like, the primary audience is a younger-ish audience.
Well, think about it, though. It is for a younger audience, and I loved it as a younger audience, but it is a long film. It does, in some senses, take a while to get to, not the point, because you know what the point is immediately, but to get through all of the different characters that are going to be there at the final battle takes some time, because that's essentially what this story is. It's not unlike, I mean, The Lord of the Rings starts with, okay, we found our hobbit, and here the dwarves came like pre-packaged, right?
Pre-packaged dwarves.
Here's your dwarves. They're going to go on an adventure with you, and I'm the sorcerer, and I'm also going with you. That doesn't happen in Willow. All you have is Willow and a baby. He needs to find his warrior. He needs to find his sorcerer, his magic user. And then inevitably he needs to find an army, but he needs to collect those people along the way. And that takes time. It's not something that in an epic fantasy story usually happens immediately. It's something that takes place over time. And this is kind of condensed down into a 2 hour film. But unfortunately, that means that we miss out on a lot of extra pieces that could have been there potentially, but would have made this film 6 hours, right? Like, to have any more development. Granted, I think there could have been some script changes that might have played into a little bit more of the relationship between Saoirse and her mother. Although I think we get it, because she very specifically expresses how disappointed in her daughter she is. Even though she says she has my idea, or I trust her more than anyone, hubris will do that to an evil sorceress, right? But otherwise, we do find out that Bavmorda is very disappointed in Saoirse, because Saoirse keeps failing, right? Granted, it turns out General Kale fails at it too, but he gets slapped for it.
Normally, you just die. Like in Star Wars, like you just get strangled to death. So to be fair, like, perks of the job, the worst thing that happens to you is you just get slapped a few times.
Not
like,
so
I'll
bad.
take that.
Yeah, really.
Not so bad. Not like, being choked in front of all your friends.
But I think that was a lot of what the critics were complaining about. It was essentially, it boils down to, there's too much, and it's too similar to too many other things. I think that's a failing on the part of the critics, though, because to me, this is the best high fantasy film. And I'm including things like Labyrinth. I'm not including Legend, because that's a terrible movie. Fight me. That includes Labyrinth, Dark Crystal. What else do we have? Neverending Story, which isn't actually a high fantasy film. It's very close to one, but it's different. What else did we have in the 80s? Lady Hawk, granted. That's not a kid's movie.
No, it's not.
So we also had Dragon Slayer.
Not for kids.
Definitely not for kids.
There's nudity in that one.
Time Bandits, maybe. Then you have things like Beastmaster. Oh, obviously Princess Bride. Princess Bride came out the year before, and I think
It's got compared to it.
Right, but I think that's an utterly unfair comparison because
the
The
same kind of
Princess
film.
Bride is very firmly one type of story, which is not... It's high fantasy, but it's a spoof of high fantasy, and it plays out very differently. This is a solid fantasy film, by which I mean that it is in the same sort of realm as things like, that are terrible, by the way, Legend, Conan, Dragon Slayer.
I'm sorry, you're saying terrible?
Excalibur was not terrible.
Neither was Conan.
Oh, please, it's not a great movie.
Okay, we're moving on right now because I would like us to still be friends after this.
I love it.
How dare you?
I love it.
How dare you?
I love it.
I, like Sorcia's mother, I've never been this disappointed in someone in my life, Jen.
I can only feel bitterness towards you now.
Absolutely.
But I mean, let's look at what it's being compared to, because they're comparing. If you were comparing it to other high fantasy films, this one still stands out as a fantastic high fantasy adventure film, in my opinion.
Okay, well, let me give you some perspective on why this is the way that it is. Keep in mind that a lot of critics also said a lot of negative things about Star Wars. Like, I think that sometimes people kind of forget that there's a fairly long history of critics really not getting fantasy, getting science fiction, getting a lot of stuff, especially stuff meant for a younger audience. That still happens somewhat today. We've seen a little bit more advancement in sort of respect for the kid film, the child film. But there's like a long history of this stuff being where mainstream critics would sort of rip these things and call them sophomore or childish, or would say that it's not as good as that other one that I also happen to like, because in some ways Princess Bride has a bit of intellectualness to it that I think that this film doesn't have. This one's more, I think, a bit more straight fantasy. It's less self-aware of the kind of film it is than, say, Princess Bride. And so I think that culturally, this is getting what a lot of films at that point are getting, which is like, oh, you're just a fantasy film. I'm not going to appreciate you on the merits of just what you are. I'm going to compare you unfairly to things that you just shouldn't be compared to in the first place. Now I'm not saying it's better today, because we can certainly see like the like upper echelon of critics, and I put them up there only because they've placed themselves there, not because I think that's an actual valid pedestal. They still will say things like, well, this film doesn't deserve award nominations because it's just science fiction. We're seeing pushback on this now. Like, Academy Awards are now being given out to genre films more regularly, and they're becoming more common, but that culture still exists where there are still critics who just don't think this is real film. Like, for God's sake, Martin Scorsese, like, and I think Spielberg kind of was like doing this I hate Netflix thing, but Scorsese was like, all of these like superhero films are like, it's not real cinema,
right?
Right. You know, and so like this film is following, unfairly getting some of that. Also, there's probably something to be said, like, we're coming at this from a weird perspective in that we're both super dorks.
We are.
We are like level 637 dorks.
Yeah, but by the age of 10, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons. You know,
yeah,
like...
that's not a level in D&D. 637 is not a level, but that's what level dork we are. And we're also coming at this from being nerds for many, many years, in like decades for us. And coming back and watching something that as kids we probably enjoyed quite a lot, and not running in... I think you and I run into this problem a lot less than others do, which is like we can go back and watch stuff from when we were younger and not hate all of them. Like, some things don't age well.
No, some things definitely do not age well. And we've also very specifically picked films for Into the Wardrobe that we loved as children, so that changes things a little bit.
I know. I tried to get you to do Mac and Me, but you just don't have any respect for me.
Sorry, I didn't like that as a child. I never actually saw. I've never seen Mac and Me, and I'm not going to change that. What I think though is, like, here's a review. This was done in 2018, and this person, Dave Aldridge, is an idiot. Okay, so this is a quote. "It's forced, formulaic, and sadly lacking in that sense of magic that's at the root of all successful fantasy."
Wrong.
I disagree with every single piece of that sentence. And not only would I have disagreed with that as a child, because it has some things that, okay, for one thing, this is ostensibly a movie about if you kill this person, then you will not be overthrown. But it's obviously makes you think about like the meaning of prophecy. Like, is the prophecy, is it self-fulfilling? And I think in this case, we see a movie that is essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy, or a story.
That's precisely what happens, right? Because Bavmorda, in her fur to defeat the people that are trying to fight her, she essentially uses this ancient spell on herself and banishes her own soul from this realm so that she can never be in power again.
Yeah, exactly. She destroys herself because of a prophecy that says a child will overthrow you. A child can't overthrow anybody. She's just a baby. She has literally no power. And even though Charalandra says she's special and all of these other things, and apparently she can talk to babies, or babies can talk to her. I don't know. Maybe Elora Danan can just talk to her. Regardless, it's a baby with no power. It's the people that the baby brings together that are part of what destroys Bavmorda. But more than anything, Bavmorda's fear of the baby is what destroys her. Very specifically in that final scene, because she's so terrified that the baby is gone and out of her clutches that she literally accidentally kills herself, right?
Yeah.
She stumbles and falls. That's what kills her, because she's just like freaking out. It's amazing that that's how this story works. And I don't think you actually see a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies that are so specifically self-fulfilling.
Wait, she doesn't stumble and fall. She goes with the wand to strike down Willow and gets struck by the very lightning she was trying to control before.
But if you notice, the first thing she does is she stumbles, knocks over the potion that is supposed to banish the child, because the potion is part of it. She knocks it over, the red cloud stuff comes up, and then she raises the wand. So it's all part of her literally messing up because she's so angry that the child has disappeared. And the child hasn't actually disappeared. It's like 5 feet away because Willow Ufgood is a great magician. My point is, I think in a lot of fantasy, you have prophecies that are just straight prophecies, and they don't work out as necessarily self-fulfilling prophecies. This one is very specifically a prophecy that is self-fulfilling. Because Bavmorda could have just killed the child, but in one of the great turns of this film, she doesn't, because she's like, I can't just kill the child. I have to get rid of the child's power. So I have to put her through this ritual so that we utterly banish the child. She's not just dead. She is like gone forever, which is great because it means that's what starts the story, is this idea, because there's so many stories are like that there's not even a good excuse for not killing a thing. Like, I must kill this person, but first I must go through step A, B, C, D, and E in order to kill that person. But not for any reason, just because I feel like it. This is built into the magical system of the world, which is great. And then other things happen. Fin Raziel being an old woman, while the whole time you're literally expecting her to be a young sorceress, you know?
That's what Matt Mardigan wants.
Right. It's hilarious. The warriors getting turned into pigs, which is a fantastic, terrifying scene, by the way.
Yeah.
And then using a trick that Willow comes up with. All of that.
Sorry, I'm turning into a pig.
That's fine. Unexpected moments of a story. I didn't expect those things to happen. I did not expect that the final battle is not one between two warriors. There are battles going on between two male warriors. They are fighting.
Yeah, but that's not the main battle. That's like the side battle that allows the main battle to happen. Because the main battle is between two older women and Willow,
who isn't part of the battle. He's just there trying to save Elora. But the battle is between Fin Raziel and Bavmorda, two women past a certain age, doing
what Gandalf and Sauron are going to do in the Lord of the Rings fight that we get in the 2000s.
It's actually a very similar fight, and
very.
if he was not inspired by this fight, he's lying.
Straight up, because there's the moment where she's Finn Razel's throwing her around through the air, and I'm like, that's almost exactly what happens to Gandalf.
Exactly, and it's really adorable. Her cackles, I mean, like...
She kind of is a little evil, it seems.
She is, because she's been waiting to face Bath Morda this entire time, and so, like...
Decades.
Oh, it is amazing.
I think what you're getting at is that some of the critics... Like, they seem to not believe that this film has the excitement and adventure that great fantasy films can have, when it clearly has those things and in spades, right? It's got chase scenes. It's got big action sequences. It's got sword fights. It's got magic fights. It's got big monsters and weird creatures and magic and wonder and all of this stuff going on. It has everything that you'd anticipate from a great fantasy film, but yet for some reason the critics couldn't quite see it. And a lot of critics seem to take so many issues with this. And we're sitting here going, look, we don't get it. Because this is a fantastic, absolutely delightful film.
I'm not going to say that it's sexism, but I'm going to say it's sexism because, come on, what else could it be? Honestly.
I think it's probably there. I don't think that's the main thing. I think probably the main thing is a rejection of fantasy in particular, because fantasy has had a hard time being taken seriously in film. Like, what's weird is it didn't used to be, because a lot of silent films are effectively just fantasy films. You know, they do all these amazing things, and that was seemingly more accepted. But then it became like, no, we want serious drama. Serious drama, everybody. It must be serious. So serious. Yeah. Oh, no, that's not... Oh, I need that serious drama. It's so tasty. Oh, yes.
Lord Wittershins would like some serious drama.
Some serious drama. Yeah.
And yes, we are basically the bankers in Mary Poppins.
That's not what I was... I don't know what I was doing, but all I'm thinking is, like, what these guys probably sit around doing is going, Citizen Kane.
Yeah, but that's who I picture every time I'm being, like, serious drama is the bankers from Mary Poppins. I can't really... I think they're, like, the ultimate, like, portrayal of stodgy old men with bad opinions.
It is, and to be totally fair, like... Look, I can kind of get where some of these people are coming from because they come from a particular film training, and I use training loosely here because some of them are probably self-taught, where, you know, the films that were important in their day, that were being hailed as masterpieces, and some of them really are masterpieces, are of a particular kind of film. And so they were sort of like raised in the fires, as it were, of a certain way of thinking about cinema. We're a little bit lucky today, which is that we can both be about like the serious drama. We can be about something like Get Out, which it's a horror film, but it has fantastical elements, but it is very serious in a lot of the presentation.
I'm sorry. What? While half listening to you, I'm also half reading Gene Siskel's review of Willow from 1988, and I am
what Siskel
legit
thinks?
Offended and angry.
Okay. Well, thanks for totally ruining my moment. I appreciate it.
I really apologize, but he uses a term for little people. The
M word?
The M word, yes.
Oh! Well, I guess the interruption was appropriate. Can we actually... there are two things I actually just want to say before we need to actually close this thing out, because we've been talking forever. And the two things were, let's keep this Siskel thing in, because I think it's important to note. This film intentionally does not use that word. It does use a term that is meant to be offensive towards the Nelwyn, but it explicitly invents its own term, right? It uses the term peck, and it refers to them that way. Now, keep in mind, right, these are meant to be, like, different... in fantasy we would say racist, but that's not, like, racist is just not the right word. They're like kind of like different species, right? And so when they're saying peck, right, like, yes, it's offensive, but it's offensive towards the Nelwyn. It's meant to be about Nelwyn people, not about little people or people with dwarfism. Whereas the M word, if they had used that, would undermine that entirely. And you could not have that, because then it would just be a bunch of people being super gross. And this film avoids that. It's still cruel. Peck is often said not everyone is saying it with the same bitterness as other characters, but everybody's saying it as in a dismissive way of like, oh, you're just a little peck. What do you know, peck?
Even the brownies use it, though, which is hilarious.
Yeah, Matt Mardigan uses it at the beginning, kind of like he's lashing out because he's trapped and he's just being a jerk. Eventually that goes away, right? He stops calling him peck. But yeah. But I want to point that out because in the 80s, you know, it still wouldn't have been acceptable to use the M word. It would have seemed more acceptable at that time period for the majority of people. And still to this day, this is part of the reason I think this film is really important, because it's got a positive portrayal of people with dwarfism. To this day, right, like people like Peter Dinklage are still like fighting to get dwarf tossing ended.
Oh, right.
Now, I get that there's a potential there that like somebody who happens to have dwarfism is like volunteering because they think it's fun. I'm sure that's a possibility. I don't know a whole lot about it.
It's a way to make a living, you know.
It is certainly a way to make a living, yeah. But the fact of the matter is, right, like people with dwarfism are still treated poorly in a lot of quarters of the world, right? In the West, right, we treat them certainly better than some other parts of the world, right, where they may be viewed a little bit more negatively. But we still don't treat them with the same respect, right? I mean, like a Peter Dinklage is really important because he is one of a handful of actors with dwarfism who has received very serious accolades for his work. Right, his most notable, obviously, being Tyrion Lannister in Game of Thrones. We won't talk about the performance of that, but the fact is that is a thing that we're still fighting now. And so I think it's really important that this film uses a term that is not based in our reality in order to have that element without falling into that trap. And part of the reason why I think this film still holds up a bit is because it doesn't use that word.
Yeah, and that's why I very specifically, and I apologize, I was just like, oh, this is Gene Siskel, I wonder what he said. And he's talking basically about how he's like, none of the characters are engaging. And I'm like, well, you clearly don't know what you're talking about, but...
He's been wrong a lot, Jen.
But he used the M word, and I have not heard that used in a long time, thank goodness. And... I'm angry like right now because of it. So
you are angry about something written in the 1980s.
I am literally angry about something written in the 1980s because it's used very dismissively. So it's offensive on a lot of levels, not just for the word itself, but the fact that the word is being used utterly to dismiss the characters and the story and Warwick Davis and every other actor that's playing one of the Nolan. And the movie itself. Like, it's very, very upsetting. I think you are right that this is kind of my disappointment with them not choosing to use people with dwarfism in something like The Lord of the Rings.
They were there, but they weren't the main actors.
No, and that was a great opportunity. That was an amazing opportunity to give more representation in film. And I will grant you that, like, okay, there is some complication in that in terms of the fact that that's not necessarily representation, right? Them being Nelwyn is not necessarily representation because they're still set apart as, in this case, not Daikini, which in this world theoretically is human, but you don't even know that. Like, you actually don't know that with the within the context of the film. They invented new words for both types of people, average-sized and little people, because they're trying to show that, A, this is a fantasy world. Don't think of them in the same context that you would in the real world. And I think there's some danger of that also in something like The Lord of the Rings, because if we, on one hand, if you use little people to portray the hobbits, then is that the only representation that little people get, right?
Yeah, because remember that there's the film Elf deals with this explicitly, right? Because the whole time, right, this children's played by Peter Dinklage, right? This children's author is like this big hotshot children's author comes in. The whole time they're playing on your expectations, because what you're expecting is some tall, imposing man to come in and like be really incredible, and it is a person with dwarfism who also is very imposing, because it's Peter Dinklage, play very well. But like the joke is like Buddy can't understand, like keep referring to him as an elf is like really offensive, because that is like part of the stereotype is they get pigeonholed into some roles because of their stature. They don't get to be other types of figures as often.
Right.
Where like they just be like a dude who like works next door and they're like, yeah, like my name's Bob. What up? And then you'd be like, oh, hi, Bob. Like, here's a pie. I'm really bad at telling normal people stories, like about like everyday people. But you get the idea of like, I see what you're saying is there's a sense of like, we're like reducing them and saying, well, the only roles you're allowed to get now are roles where you get to play things that aren't, like you just get to play these fantasy creatures. And that's like the thing that's relegated for you.
I mean, for example, Wizard of Oz, right? Like these are the films that we have so far. Ewoks. You can't even see that they're little people.
Sure. Now I will give Lucas some credit, which is that he kept Kenny Baker on as R2-D2 for all of the films in which R2-D2 was there until Kenny Baker died. Kenny Baker was a man with dwarfism who was inside R2-D2, and obviously in, the 2000s, you don't need a person inside the robot anymore, but he kept him anyway, right? He kept like all these people. Like you don't need Anthony Daniels in the darn suit. But he kept him anyway because like there's a sense of loyalty there. And I think it's really important because there's a way to which like there are physical things that certain people can do. Like an example would be like Chewbacca. It can't be played by just an average sized person because it just isn't normal. It doesn't look right. If you have to have somebody with that stature, it's got to be like a 7-foot tall guy because it just feels more natural.
It literally needs to be someone with giantism.
Right, exactly. It needs to be somebody who has the physicality to match that role because Chewbacca's not a CG character.
No,
right? And so there is like a role for people of different types of bodies that fits for certain types of things. But at the same time, that can't be the only thing they do. Right? Like we also need to have like I know that Peter Mayhew's not playing Chewbacca anymore. It's a new Juna something. I can't recall his name off the top of my head. But like Peter Mayhew, like maybe Peter Mayhew just has to be like Bill, who works at the cafeteria, or, like these other roles that are just like these people being normal people. It's kind of like when we were talking about Voyage of the Rock Aliens, like we were talking about Berryman.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's gotten some roles where he got to be quote unquote normal person.
True. That is a good case in point. So I think we need to wrap this up with our sort of final thoughts and how we think this movie holds up.
Well, before we do that, I do need to mention a very important fact, which is we were talking a long time ago, as of now, the time in the recording, about the fact that this film, it doesn't quite fill out, right? Because it's not 6 hours long. It should be noted this is originally meant to be a TV series.
Which is what it's going to be now!
Which is now, well... It has not been officially picked up by Disney.
No.
It is in the like pre-production phase where they're working on stories. But Ron Howard and Warwick Davis and Jonathan Kasdan are all working together. Warwick Davis has agreed to come back and play Willow. So there's always the possibility that this blows up and it doesn't happen. There's an interview on IMDb that is worth watching with Kevin Smith interviewing Ron Howard, where he basically says that it's in the works. So it's not a thing where it's just like people talking about it. This is like the people behind it are really trying to make it happen right now. So there's the very likely chance we get a Willow TV show. It's also worth noting there is a book series that follows this that deals with the story afterwards. Lucas did that on purpose because he realized we weren't going to get sequels.
Yes. So hopefully it will get to be in the state that originally it was meant to be. Because I think there is a lot of story there. And hopefully with the success of things like Game of Thrones, even though clearly the original Willow was targeted at a younger audience and this one wouldn't be, places like Disney Plus and Netflix are really the perfect platforms for this type of show. And obviously we're seeing that right now with The Letter for the King on Netflix, which is a young adult fantasy series that is on Netflix right now. You can go watch it. That one's a little bit more serious. Who knows what we'll get out of Willow, because there is quite a bit of comedy in this film, but it is still serious. So it's just like...
It's playful. It's fun.
It's playful. That's actually a perfect term for it.
Well, on this subject, Jen, we're kind of in your general final thoughts, and I guess the big question that you need to add to this is, do you think this still holds up for audiences today, especially the intended audience?
I mean, I think it does. My kids watched it when they were little, although I was just talking to my son. I was like, do you remember Willow from when you were little? He's like, I don't really remember it when I was little, but I remember watching it, since then. And, that's just memory banks. Once you hit 18, it's all over. But we've watched it a few times in the last few years, and my kids still enjoy it. It is still an enjoyable, fun adventure story. Like, when you get right down to it. And for myself now, as an adult, there are actually, and I've watched Willow a lot over the years, I find more to enjoy each time I watch it. Like this time, me noticing just how absolutely brilliant Julie Peters is as the mother. And once again, really genuinely appreciating that the final battle is from between two women of age. As I get older, that becomes even more important. Like the fact that a father is the hero of this story. Like, these are all things that you don't see very often, not just in fantasy. So I'm going to go with yes, because I think Willow, the character, is still a very engaging character. The brownies are fun. The fairies are fun. The magic is fun. Like, the magician sort of tricks that happen over the course of the film are great. Like, fun, again. The jokes are brilliant. It's got a really quick, witty script that, granted, leaves not as much room for sort of engaging with each of the characters as much as you might want to, but other than that, is a pretty good script, honestly. So I'm gonna go with yes, it holds up. It definitely holds up if you liked it as a child, but I think even people who have never seen it before should enjoy this as a solid fantasy film.
I'm in pretty strong agreement with you that I think overall it holds up pretty well. I mean, yes, some of the special effects, they're just too visible. You can tell some of the stuff that just this isn't well done.
But they're so much better than a lot of others. So
well, sure. But that's not the measure we use. Like, is it better than this film that's absolutely the worst, right? Is it? Yeah, we've watched some films with some of the worst special effects. After all, we covered Birdemic, which just used animated
I have never
sprites.
seen it, thank goodness. So
it's bad.
I'm never watching it.
The thing is, like, I think the story of this film still is the same delightful story it was before. It's still playful and fun and exciting and adventurous. It's still a really unique way of exploring some fairly bog standard fantasy tropes. At least by now we've seen these tropes enough. I like the way that it explores. I think it does a very good job. I would never get into a sled with Mad Mardigan because, oh my god, he just goes down the whole hill. Like, the whole thing, right? But there's just a lot of, like, really fun elements here. I think the brownies are a lot of fun. I don't understand why one of them is French, but sure. Right? There's just a lot of, like, really fun things.
Is he French just because his name is Frangine?
I know. That's Frangine. Yeah. Anyway.
But they don't say Franjon. They say Frangine. So I don't know if he's actually French. I'm just saying.
But he talks French. But anyway, the point is, what I'm getting at is, like, yeah, I think this is really good. I think the things that don't hold up are just technological stuff. What was weird to me watching this was, I know that those dogs are wearing a costume.
But it's good.
But the shooting on them is really well done. That, like, you can tell it's a costume because, like, we're adults and we can figure it out. But
those dogs were so scary when I was a kid, though.
They looked really scary. They looked fairly real for what I recognize as fairly limited options, because these aren't CG.
They tear a whole woman apart. Granted, you don't see the whole thing, but you know it's happening because you see the dogs and you see her arms flailing. It's scary.
That stuff, I think, is just, there's a lot of, like, physical elements that are very, very well done, right? The chase scene in the wagon, all of those, there's just a lot of very well done sequences.
The ruthlessness of the fights and the fact that everything actually feels heavy and brutal.
Yeah, it's not flashy. I mean, Mad Mardigan is a little bit, but it's very grounded in, like, you get hit with a sword, it's not fun happy times, right? Like, nobody's doing spinny whoop whoop, like, let me do ninja kicks and, like, I'm gonna run off the wall and we're gonna have a slow-mo fight, and it's,
Except for Sorsha. Sorsha likes her high kicks.
She likes her high kicks, but, that's because she's got wonderful legs.
But they do, like, in terms of, like, fantasy battles, these ones feel much more, like, I've heard people talk about being in armor, and, like, it's exhausting, right? Like, and these fights, it's like people are having to wear armor and are getting exhausted while being highly physical, which, that's actually how it works. It's nice. It's a nice touch. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. The point is, I think it mostly holds up. And I think this is going to be like the thing that we're going to almost always have is until we get to films that we liked as kids that maybe have not held up to the test of time by almost anyone else's measure. Because so far, all the films we've just been saying, yeah, it pretty much holds up. Some aspects don't, but for the most part, yes. And that's really where I'm at. Yeah. Pretty much overall, this holds up. There are a couple little bits that are like, is this going to be like the feminist revolution film? Absolutely not.
No, but it was closer than a lot of things that I got as a child. And I think that's the important part.
At least all of the women in this are not all presented. In fact, I don't know if there are any women explicitly presented as prostitutes. Because the one woman that Madmartigan is with is married. She has a husband. Now, he's a womanizer. He just doesn't care. If it looks like a woman vaguely in woman shape, he's happy to go.
Yeah, but if I were her, I totally would have cheated on Lug, too, so.
Well, right. His name is Lug. That should have been the giveaway.
Right.
So...
I mean, his pickup line is literally, do you want to breed?
At least he's honest. I give him that credit. He's very straight to the point.
That's disgusting.
Like sometimes like the things they say, like they try to be all smooth and like creepy sounding. He's just like, do you want to breed? Give him credit for being very to the point. Like Lug is a simple man, but he is an honest man. His passions are very well known. Now, I'm saying that a little bit jokingly, but at the same time, it is a little bit of an uncomfortable sequence.
It is.
Except for the fact that we know that it's Madmartigan dressed as a woman.
And I will say, at this point, content warning for some transmisia because of a comment that Sorsha makes to Madmartigan. That happens in the scene when they are on top of the mountain and Madmartigan is spouting poetry to Sorsha. So if that bothers you, you can skip that scene.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, anyway, so we've done it, Jen.
We have done it. We went way over long, as per the usual. I will be cutting this down to an hour, which means that we're going to miss every intelligent thing that we said.
We recorded for a while.
I mean, it'll probably just be me cutting myself out. That's what I usually do.
I mean, to be fair, honestly, I said like 6 words this whole podcast, so.
This whole podcast, just 6 words.
Well, in any case, thanks for joining us for Into the Wardrobe today. Join us next time when we... whenever next time will be when we discuss another classic film from our childhood. There are many of them because we were born in the 80s and late 70s. Back in the dark times.
A million years ago. Considering the fact that just the month of March took 10,000 years. It's been a while.
Oh my God.
So, yeah.
Yeah. As always, folks, do take care of yourselves. We realize not everybody probably can avoid going out, because some of you might have to go to work and those kinds of things. You might not have many choices, but please be safe. Please wash your hands, all that good stuff, and we wish all of the safety and love to all of your families. We know this is a tough time for a lot of people all over the world. So, just do the best to take care of yourself as much as you can.
Quick point, if we talked about people with dwarfism in a way that you did not find correct, please let us know so that we can get better in the future. We always try our best, but that doesn't mean that we actually did it right. So please let us know.
And we'll make a correction on the next recording we do.
Absolutely. But in the meantime, you can reach us anytime that you would like at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. You can find book reviews and our prior podcasts at skiffyandfanty.com. And we have a newsletter that is done by the fantastic Stephen Guy Miller every single month at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. And as always, if you would like to support us, please do so by going to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. And you can find us on Twitter, first at the main place, at Skiffy and Fanty, or you can find myself at Loop-de-Loo.
And you can find me at Sean Duke.
And in the meantime... Yep, there it is.
Awkward ending and scene.
Bye.
If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. You can also find us on our website, skiffyandfanty.com, and on Twitter at skiffyandfanty. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The music for this episode comes from Sphere by Creo. You can find out more about their music at freemusicarchive.org.